The Traveler Cats. What if Iseei travel time with Koneko and grown up and marry her? Chapter 1. Iseei had never believed in fate, mostly because fate had never once been convenient for him. He was 22 years old, 3 semesters behind on his engineering degree, and standing in the rain outside a shuttered noodle shop because his apartment key had snapped off in the lock an hour earlier. The city lights smeared across the wet pavement in long orange streaks. Somewhere behind him a delivery scooter sputtered past, throwing up a fan of water that missed him by inches and soaked the hem of his jacket anyway. He was not thinking about destiny. He was thinking about how he was going to explain a broken lock to his landlord, and whether the 24-hour convenience store 2 blocks down sold anything that could pass for dinner. That was when he heard it. A small, wet, furious sound coming from the gap between the noodle shop and the shuttered flower stall beside it. He almost walked past it. He told himself later, many times, in many different years, that he had almost walked past it, and that if he had, none of what followed would have happened, and some nights that thought comforted him, and some nights it did not. He crouched down instead. In the gap between the buildings, pressed as far back from the rain as the narrow space allowed, was a kitten. Not a stray cat kitten, though at first that was exactly what it looked like. A small gray shape barely bigger than his hand, ears flattened, one eye squeezed shut against the water dripping from a gutter joint above. Iseei had never owned a pet. His building did not allow them. He had no plan, no bag, no box. He took off his jacket anyway and held it out like an idiot, murmuring nonsense the way people do at small frightened animals, and after a long moment of hissing consideration the kitten crept forward and let itself be gathered up. It was heavier than a kitten had any right to be. That was the first strange thing, though he did not clock it as strange until much later, because in the moment he was simply relieved the small violent shivering had stopped. The second strange thing was the collar. A thin band of tarnished metal, half hidden in wet fur, engraved with characters he did not recognize and that seemed, when the streetlight caught them at a certain angle, to move. He carried the kitten home in his ruined jacket, picked the broken key out of the lock with a bent paperclip because apparently that was a skill he had, and by the time he had toweled the animal half dry on his kitchen floor it had stopped shivering and started, very cautiously, to purr. "You can stay one night," he told it. "One night. Then we find your owner." The kitten looked up at him with eyes that were, he would swear later, entirely too knowing for something that small, and went back to washing a paw. He did not find an owner. He put up a notice at the corner shop, asked the old woman who ran the flower stall, checked 3 separate lost pet forums with a photo that made the kitten look almost normal, small and gray and unremarkable except for the eyes. Nobody claimed her. He started calling her Koneko, because he was not creative at midnight and because it meant kitten and she was, in fact, a kitten, and somehow within a week that had simply become her name. The building's no pets policy turned out to be more theoretical than enforced. His landlord, informed at last, only shrugged and said, "As long as she doesn't chew the wiring I don't care, kid." Koneko did not chew the wiring. Koneko did other things. 3 weeks after the rain, Iseei woke at 2 in the morning to find the collar sitting on his desk, empty, and Koneko standing in the middle of his floor on 2 legs. He would think, replaying it years afterward, that the strangest part was not that she had become a girl. It was that she was so obviously still trying to be a cat about it. She stood with her weight on the balls of her feet the way a person does after standing on all fours their entire life. Her ears, which had not gone anywhere, swiveled at every sound. She looked at her own hands like they belonged to someone else, and had been loaned to her under unclear terms. She could not have been more than 7 or 8 years old, by the measure of a human child, small and gray-haired with those same 2 knowing eyes, wrapped in nothing but the blanket she had dragged off his bed, staring at him with an expression that was somewhere between apology and defiance. "You should not have picked me up in the rain," she said. Her voice was a child's voice, thin and careful, like she was testing each word before she trusted it fully. "It complicates things." Iseei sat very still on the edge of his bed for a long moment. Later he would tell people, on the rare occasions he told anyone any of this at all, that his first thought was not fear, and it was not confusion. His first thought was that he needed to find her some real clothes before she caught cold, because whatever else was happening, a child was standing in his apartment in a blanket at 2 in the morning. And that fact outranked every impossible thing about her. What complicates things, he said, and got up to dig through his drawers for the smallest t-shirt he owned. She told him, over the next several days, in pieces, the way a person tells a story they are not sure they are allowed to tell. She was not from his city. She was not, strictly, from his year. She belonged to a lineage of beings her people called Watchers, small guardian spirits bound to particular threads of time, and something had gone wrong with her thread, torn it loose from wherever it was supposed to be anchored, and she had fallen through the tear in the smallest, safest shape she had, a kitten, because a kitten draws less attention and survives more falls than almost anything else does. So you're stuck here, Iseei, I said. I am stuck to you, Koneko corrected, with the patient, faintly superior tone of someone explaining something obvious to someone slow. You touched me during the fall. You are the anchor now. Wherever the thread pulls, you go, and wherever you go, I go. Until it heals itself, or until someone stronger than me fixes it on purpose. And how long does that take? She considered the question with the total seriousness of a child asked something she genuinely does not know the answer to. I do not know. It could be a season. It could be longer than your whole life. Iseei had, by any reasonable account, every right to panic at that point, and did not, mostly because Koneko herself did not seem to expect him to. She expected, if anything, that he would be angry, and braced for it in small ways he noticed only afterward, the way she positioned herself near the door of whatever room they were in, the way she flinched very slightly the first time he raised his voice at all, even in surprise rather than anger. He decided within the first week that whatever was happening to his life, he was not going to be the reason a child flinched, and he built the rest of his choices out from that one. He told his landlord she was his cousin's kid, staying while her parents sorted out a divorce. He told his few friends the same. He enrolled her, once it became clear the season estimate was optimistic, in the neighborhood elementary school under a birth certificate that Koneko produced from somewhere he decided not to ask about, a document that felt, when he held it, faintly warm, like it had been made rather than printed. The first jump happened 4 months in. They were crossing the pedestrian bridge over the river, Koneko's small hand tucked into his because she still did not fully trust curbs, when the whole bridge simply was not there anymore. Not destroyed, not exploded. Absent. In its place was a wooden footbridge, older, narrower, strung with paper lanterns that were not lit because it was daylight. And the city on the far bank was the same city and was not the same city at all, lower, smokier, full of buildings he did not recognize with rooflines he did. Koneko's hand tightened hard enough to hurt. I am sorry, she said, very quietly, staring straight ahead. I told you it complicates things. How far Iseei managed, I do not know yet. I will know when I see a calendar. It was, they determined by evening, 83 years in the past. They spent 11 days there, sleeping in a rented room above a tea house. Iseei working out labor for coin. The tea house owner's wife quietly explained how to spend without drawing suspicion. Koneko sitting very still in corners watching everyone with those unchildlike eyes, until the thread, as she put it, found its balance again, and the pedestrian bridge and the modern skyline snapped back around them like a rubber band releasing. He was late for work by 11 days he could not explain and lost the job. It was, he would come to understand, going to be a pattern. Chapter 2. They did not go every month. Some years passed uneventfully, ordinary school years and ordinary birthdays, Koneko growing the slow deliberate way real children grow, an inch here, a missing tooth there, a vocabulary that widened out of the strange formal cadence of her first months into something that sounded, more and more, like an actual kid from his actual neighborhood, right down to the slang she picked up from classmates, and used, deliberately, to watch him wince. But the jumps kept happening, unpredictable, sometimes months apart and once, brutally, twice in the same week, and slowly Iseei stopped thinking of his life as a thing that had jumps in it, and started thinking of it as a life that happened between jumps. He learned to keep a bag ready by the door, food that would not spoil, a fire starter, cash in 3 different currencies from 3 different decades because that was apparently a currency Koneko's country used across a span of time that made his head hurt to think about too directly. He learned, from painful trial, which centuries were safe to speak freely in and which required silence and downcast eyes and careful clothing borrowed or bought the moment they arrived. He learned that Koneko, for all her strangeness, got carsick in any vehicle from any era, and airsick once, memorably, on the one occasion the thread deposited them briefly in a decade with commercial flight, and that she hated the taste of anything sour with a passion disproportionate to the inconvenience of it, and that she slept, always, curled into the smallest possible shape in the corner of whatever bed they had, a habit 8 years of being human had not undone. He learned, too, that she was watching out for him at least as often as he was watching out for her. The eras were not always kind. There was a winter, when she was perhaps 11 in the way he had come to measure her age, cold and lean and hungry, in a decade whose name he later looked up and never repeated aloud, when a man had followed them from a market stall with the particular unhurried confidence of someone who did not expect to be stopped, and Koneko had put herself between Iseei and the man without being asked, small and shaking and utterly immovable, until Iseei got them both around a corner and lost the man in an alley he still dreamed about sometimes. "You're supposed to let me protect you," Iseei told her afterward, furious in the specific useless way of fear turned into anger. "That's the whole point of me being the adult here." Koneko had looked up at him, unimpressed, with an expression that made it very clear she considered the concept of him being the adult here to be a technicality she tolerated rather than a fact she believed. "You are the anchor," she said. "I am the one who is supposed to keep the anchor safe. That is the actual arrangement. You have been doing it backward the whole time, and I let you because it made you feel better." It became, after that, something they did without discussing it, a kind of unspoken division of the same job, each of them quietly certain the other was the one who needed protecting and neither of them ever quite winning the argument. The years she called her growing years passed like that, in ordinary school terms interrupted by impossible weeks, in birthdays celebrated with whatever cake was available and whatever century they happened to be stranded in for it, in a running joke between them that Koneko had now technically had more birthdays than anyone alive, if you counted the ones spent in the wrong decade twice. At 13, in his measure, she stopped fitting easily into his lap during long train rides and started sitting beside him instead, arms crossed, chin up, pretending this was not itself a kind of milestone, and Iseei pretended not to notice that it was. At 15, she started disappearing for hours at a time whenever a jump stranded them somewhere with a library, returning with books on history and language and once, to his considerable alarm, basic swordsmanship, explaining without much patience that a watcher who did not understand the eras she moved through was a liability to her anchor, and he could either help her study or get out of the light. At 16, she stopped letting him introduce her as his cousin, and he switched, without either of them ever formally agreeing to it, to calling her his ward, which was true, and which felt, increasingly, like it was not quite the whole truth, though either of them said so. He turned 26 the year she turned 17. He remembered it specifically because it was the year the jumps, without explanation, without any of the warning signs Koneko had spent a decade learning to read, simply stopped. Chapter 3. They noticed the absence before they understood it. 6 months without a jump, then 8, then a full year, the longest stable stretch either of them had lived through since the night in the rain. Koneko took it badly, in the quiet, controlled way she took most things badly, spending whole evenings with old maps and older notebooks spread across the kitchen table, calculating and recalculating something Iseei only partly understood, the geometry of a thread that should have been healing and did not seem, by her math, to be healing at all. "It might mean it is fixed," Iseei offered once, not quite believing it, and offering it anyway because she looked like she needed someone to say it. "It might mean it has found a new anchor point it likes better," Koneko said, not looking up from the notebook, and stopped moving because it is comfortable, the way a boat stops drifting once it snags on something. "That is not the same as fixed. That is just quiet." She would not say, for a long time, what she thought the something was that it had snagged on, and Iseei, watching her go faintly stiff and careful whenever he pressed, eventually let it go the way he had learned to let go of the things she was not ready to say. Life, in the meantime, insisted on continuing to be a life. Iseei went back to school, finished the degree he had abandoned mid-jump 6 years earlier, took a job at a small engineering firm that did not ask too many questions about the gap in his employment history because the man who ran it had gaps of his own he did not discuss. Koneko finished secondary school a year ahead of her age group despite an attendance record that should by any reasonable standard have gotten her expelled, and enrolled, over Iseei's mild but genuine protest that she did not have to, in a university 2 train stops from the apartment they still shared, because either of them had ever seriously discussed not sharing it. It was, on the surface, an almost embarrassingly ordinary stretch of years. He paid rent. She went to lectures. They argued about whose turn it was to do the dishes and settled it, as they always had, by whoever lost rock paper scissors 2 times running, a system Koneko had once accused him of rigging and had never quite been able to prove. It was also, underneath the surface, a stretch of years in which Iseei found himself, with increasing and uncomfortable frequency, noticing things about the person across the table from him that he had spent a very long time not noticing, or not letting himself notice, back when noticing them would have been an unforgivable thing to do. He noticed the way she still curled into the corner of whatever seat she was in, a decade and a half of human living never quite erasing a decade and a half of jumps before that. He noticed that she had grown, at last, into the eyes that had always looked too old for her face, so that now they simply looked like her eyes, sharp and steady and entirely too good at reading him. He noticed that she still, on the rare bad nights, when some old fear from some old year surfaced without warning, came and sat on the far end of his couch without a word, not touching, not speaking, just present, the way she had at 11, at 8, at every age he had watched her be, and that some part of him had never stopped being the person who sat there and let her. He told himself, for a long time, that this was simply what it looked like to love someone the way you love family. He was not entirely lying to himself. It had started that way, and for years that had been true and complete and enough. He was not lying to himself, later, either, when he admitted it had stopped being only that, somewhere in the ordinary unremarkable middle of an ordinary unremarkable year, and that he had no idea what to do about it, because the entire architecture of who they were to each other had been built, brick by brick, on the fact that he was the one who was supposed to know better. He did not say anything. He told himself this was wisdom. He suspected, some nights, that it was cowardice wearing wisdom's coat, and did not examine the suspicion too closely. Koneko, for her part, said nothing either, which he would learn, much later, was not the same thing as having nothing to say. It was the middle of that quiet year, on an evening no different from 100 others, dishes half done and rock paper scissors abandoned mid-round, that the thread pulled again for the first time in 14 months, and the kitchen simply was not their kitchen anymore, and everything that had been quietly, carefully unspoken between them was about to run out of room to stay that way. Chapter 4. The kitchen they landed in was not empty. That was the first thing Iseei registered, before the smell of wood smoke, before the low ceiling beams that had not been there a heartbeat ago, before the sound of voices in a language his ears understood as familiar and his mind understood as very old. A woman at a stone hearth turned with a ladle still in her hand and a scream halfway up her throat. Koneko moved before he did. She always moved first now, a fact he had stopped resenting and started simply relying on the way you rely on a compass needle. She said something low and fast in the woman's own tongue, palms open, and whatever she said cut the scream off before it fully formed. Travelers, Koneko said again, slower, for Iseei's benefit as much as the woman's. Blown off our road by weather. Nothing more. The woman did not look convinced. Few people ever did. But she lowered the ladle, and that was, in Koneko's long experience, generally the difference between a night that ended safely and one that did not. They worked out over the following 2 days of careful, deferential conversation, somewhere close to 400 years back, in a mountain village whose name meant, roughly, the place where the river forgets its way. It should have been, by every rule Koneko had spent a decade compiling, one of the harder eras to survive and without drawing suspicion neither of them could afford. It was, instead, oddly gentle. The village took them in the way isolated villages sometimes do, less out of trust than out of the practical calculation that 2 extra pairs of hands were worth more than the risk of 2 strangers, and Iseei spent the days chopping wood and mending a fence with a skill that surprised even him, some muscle memory built out of years of odd labor in a dozen other centuries, while Koneko sat with the village's few elderly women and came back each evening knowing things she had not known that morning, herbs and stitchwork, and once, a lullaby she hummed under her breath for weeks afterward without seeming to notice she was doing it. It was in that village, on the 4th night, that Iseei woke to find the space beside the low fire empty where Koneko should have been sleeping, and found her instead sitting outside on the cold step, wrapped in a borrowed shawl, looking up at a sky so full of stars it looked, to a man raised under city light pollution, almost fake. He sat down beside her without asking. It was, by then, its own kind of language between them, the sitting down without asking. I keep thinking, she said, after a while, about how none of these people know what is going to happen to them. The floods, the sickness, the war that comes through here in 11 years and burns half of this to the ground. I read about it, in a library, 6 centuries from where we started. I know things about their own future that they will never get to know, and I cannot tell them a single word of it, and some nights that feels like the cruelest thing I carry. You didn't do it to them, Iseei, I said. You just know it. Watchers are supposed to only watch, Koneko said. That is the whole discipline of it. My mother spent 40 years teaching me to watch and say nothing, do nothing, change nothing, because a thread that gets pulled changes every thread woven near it, and you cannot always see how far the change travels before it is too late to take back. She pulled the shawl tighter. And then I fell out of the sky into your hands in the rain, and you picked me up anyway, and I have been changing your thread every day since, and you have been changing mine right back, and I do not think either of us has said no even once. Do you want to say no? She was quiet long enough that he thought she might not answer at all. No, she said finally, very simply. I have never once wanted to say no. That is what frightens me about it. He did not understand, that night, exactly what she meant by frightens. He would understand it better later, once he had a name of his own for the thing he had also never wanted to say no to and had also never once said aloud. The jump home, when it came 12 days later, was as sudden and as ordinary in its suddenness as all the others. The mountain village folding away mid-breath and their own kitchen table reappearing under Iseei's hands exactly where he had left it. The dishes he had abandoned still sitting half-washed in the sink as though no time had passed at all, though the calendar on the wall insisted, correctly, that nearly 2 weeks had. Chapter 5. The jumps that followed that year came closer together than they had in a long time, as though something that had been resting had woken up and remembered it had work to do. A week in a coastal town rebuilding after a storm that Koneko would not let him ask too many questions about. 3 days in a decade with electric light but no computers, where Koneko, footsore and irritable, declared this the single most annoying century to be stranded in because everything took forever and nothing was labeled correctly. A jarring, nauseating half-day forward, the only time the thread had ever pulled them ahead of where they started rather than back, into a version of their own city grown taller and stranger and quieter, where Koneko went pale and would not describe what she had seen in a newspaper stand before Iseei physically turned her away from it, and refused, afterward, to discuss that trip at all, ever, in any year. Through all of it, the shape of their days together kept shifting in small ways either of them named out loud. Koneko was 18 now, by every measure that mattered, finishing her second year of university with a transcript that made her professors ask, more than once, what her secret was, and Iseei had watched the last of the child in her fold itself away the way morning fog folds away from a hillside, not vanishing exactly, still visible if you knew where to look, but no longer the thing standing in front of you. She had her own key to the apartment now, her own half of the bookshelf that had somehow taken over an entire wall, her own opinions about the wallpaper he had never gotten around to changing, delivered with the specific irritated affection of someone who had lived in a space long enough to consider it partly hers to complain about. She still sat on the far end of the couch on bad nights. She had started, without either of them commenting on it, sitting slightly less far. It was Iseei's sister, of all people, visiting for a weekend that happened to fall in one of their longer stable stretches, who said the thing neither of them had said, over dinner, watching Koneko argue with Iseei about a documentary with the easy, well-worn rhythm of two people who had been finishing each other's sentences for a decade. You know you look at her the way Dad used to look at Mom, his sister said quietly, once Koneko had gone to the kitchen for more tea. Right before he was going to propose. I remember that exact face. You've had it on all night. She's my ward, Iseei said too fast, the way you say something you have practiced saying so many times in your own head that it comes out sounding rehearsed even when you did not intend it to. She's 22 years old by every legal document in this apartment, and she has not called you that word once tonight, his sister said, not unkindly. I'm not telling you what to do, I'm telling you that you're not as subtle as you think you are, and that eventually somebody less polite than me is going to say it in front of her instead of in front of you, and I'd rather you heard it first. He did not sleep well that night. He lay awake doing the math he had been carefully avoiding doing for years, the actual math, the fact that whatever strange path had brought them here, Koneko was, by every measure that any court or church or curious stranger would ever apply, an adult, had been one for years now, had chosen every single day of those years, freely and without any pressure from him, to stay in his apartment, share his table, sit closer on his couch, and that the only thing standing between the truth of how he felt and the saying of it out loud was his own decade-old fear of a version of himself that no longer existed, the version who had crouched in the rain over something small and lost, and had built an entire identity around being the one who kept it safe rather than the one who might, someday, want something more complicated than that. He did not say anything the next morning either. He was not, it turned out, a brave man about this particular thing, whatever else the years and the centuries had made him. Chapter 6. The confession, when it finally happened, was not planned by either of them, and happened, fittingly, in the middle of a jump. They had landed, that time, somewhere either of them could immediately place, a stretch of coastline with none of the landmarks Koneko usually used to orient herself, empty of any town at all, just cliffs and wind and a grey restless sea. Koneko stood very still at the edge of the grass, notebook forgotten in her bag, an expression on her face Iseei had never seen there before, something between wonder and grief. "I know this place," she said finally. "I have never been here. But I know it. It is the coast near where my mother's line began, before there was ever a village here, before there was ever anyone here to build one. This is what the world looked like before any of it. Before me. Before the thread even existed to pull anyone anywhere. How far back are we?" "Further than I have ever measured," she said. "Further than I think the thread has ever pulled anyone. I do not know why it chose today to show me this." She was quiet for a long moment, wind pulling her hair sideways, and then she said, without turning around, in a voice much smaller than her usual careful, deliberate one, "I think it chose today because I have been asking it to, without meaning to. I have been thinking, for a long time now, about beginnings, about how strange it is that mine started the moment you picked me up in the rain, and that I cannot, if I am honest, remember wanting a different one." Iseei came and stood beside her at the edge of the cliff, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, the way they had stood beside each other in a dozen centuries by then, and found that his voice, when it came, was steadier than he expected it to be, as though some part of him had been rehearsing this exact moment for years without telling the rest of him. "I picked up a kitten in the rain because I couldn't walk past something that needed help," he said. "That's all it was supposed to be, and somewhere along the way, without me ever deciding it on purpose, it turned into the fact that I cannot imagine a single version of my life, in any year, in any century we've fallen into, that I would want to live if you weren't standing in it beside me." He made himself keep going, even though every old instinct in him was screaming to stop, to make it smaller, safer, easier to take back. "I'm not telling you this because I think you owe me anything for it. I'm telling you because my sister was right, and because I am tired of being the only person in this friendship who is pretending not to know what this actually is." Koneko turned to look at him then, and there was nothing careful or deliberate in her face at all, nothing of the composed young woman who took her studies seriously and won every argument about the dishes. There was only something raw and hopeful and, for once, entirely unguarded. "I have loved you," she said, "since I was too young to have any right to say so, and I made myself wait, every year, for the year when saying it would not be a strange or unfair thing to put on you. I have been waiting for a long time, Iseei. I did not think I would have to wait for the beginning of the entire world to finally hear you say it back." He kissed her there, on a cliff older than every century they had ever fallen through, with a wind full of salt and nothing else, and it was, by any account either of them ever gave afterward, a small and quiet and entirely unremarkable kiss, the kind two people share who have already spent a lifetime, several lifetimes, learning every other way there is to love someone first. Chapter 7. Nothing about their days looked very different, after that, to anyone watching from the outside. They still argued about the dishes. Koneko still finished his sentences and Iseei still burned the rice more often than either of them wanted to admit to his sister. But something in the space between them had settled into its true shape at last, the way a key settles home into a lock it was always cut for, and neither of them saw much point any more in pretending otherwise, to themselves or to anyone else. They told his sister first, mostly because she had already half told them, and she cried in the specific loud way she cried at every important thing in her life, and hugged Koneko so hard Koneko made a small startled sound that made Iseei laugh for the first time in what felt like days. They told the old woman from the flower stall too, on a visit back to the corner where it had all started, though she only nodded slowly and said she had wondered, for years, why a boy who claimed to be looking for a lost pet's owner had looked, even then, like a man who already knew he was never giving her back. The jumps did not stop. Koneko's calculations never did settle into anything certain, and there were seasons still ahead of them, though either of them could have said it that first quiet evening on the cliff, where the thread would pull them through wars and famines and one very memorable decade of a plague either of them ever wanted to speak of again. Seasons that would test exactly how much two people could carry for each other, and still come out the other side able to make each other laugh over burned rice. But that was still ahead of them, unwritten, the way every real beginning is. For now there was only the walk home from the cliff, hand in hand, the thread pulling them gently back toward their own kitchen and their own unfinished dishes and their own ordinary, unremarkable life, the two of them stepping into it together, at last, without anything left unsaid between them. Chapter 8. Koneko's mother found them, in the end, and not the other way around, though it would be more accurate to say she had been finding them all along, watching from whatever distant vantage the elders of her line kept, waiting for the moment she judged it right to step forward at last. She arrived, if arrived was even the right word for it, on an evening indistinguishable from 1,000 other evenings, appearing in the apartment's small living room the way a held breath finally lets go, tall and gray-haired and unmistakably Koneko's, down to the same sharp, patient eyes. Koneko went very still. "Mother, you have grown," her mother said, in a voice that carried an entire library of things unsaid inside it. "Further than I expected, this early." Her gaze moved to Iseei, unhurried, assessing, the way a craftsman studies a piece of work someone else has been shaping for years without her permission. "And you are the anchor." "I am," Iseei said, and did not look away, though every instinct told him to. "Do you understand what you have taken on?" "I understood some of it the night I picked her up in the rain," he said. "I understand a great deal more of it now." He glanced at Koneko, found her watching him with something fierce and steady in her face, and found his own voice steadying to match it. "I love her. Whatever else you came here to ask me, that is the honest answer underneath all of it." Koneko's mother was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that felt, in that small living room, like weather changing. Then, unexpectedly, something in her severe face softened, just slightly, just enough. "The thread that pulled you both was never an accident," she said. "Threads like that do not tear themselves loose for no reason. They tear because they are looking for something they have not found yet." She looked at her daughter, and there was pride in it, and grief too, the particular grief of a parent watching a child become someone the parent can no longer fully protect. "I came to tell you that it has, at last, found its balance. The jumps will slow now. Not stop entirely. A thread like this one is never fully still, but slow enough that you may build something ordinary in the space between them, if that is still what you both want." "It is," Koneko said, before Iseei could even answer, quick and certain in a way that made him smile despite the strange gravity of the room. Her mother studied them both a moment longer, then inclined her head, the smallest possible bow, the kind given between equals rather than from elder to child. "Then I will not stand in the way of it," she said. "I only ask that you remember, both of you, that a thread which has finally found its balance can still be pulled loose again by carelessness. Guard it as carefully as you guarded each other." She was gone before either of them could answer, the way she had come, a held breath released. Chapter 9. The proposal, when it came, was almost embarrassingly unremarkable, which Iseei would later insist was entirely the point. It happened on a Tuesday. Koneko had a lecture that ran late, and came home irritated about a professor who had, in her professional opinion, badly misrepresented an entire century she happened to have personally lived through, and Iseei was standing at the stove burning the rice again, and somewhere in the middle of her explaining, with real heat, exactly what that professor had gotten wrong, he simply said, "Marry me," in the same tone he might have used to ask her to pass the salt. Koneko stopped mid-sentence. "That is a terrible time to ask me that." "I know," Iseei said. "I've been trying to find a good time for 2 weeks and there isn't one. There's just Tuesdays, and rice burning, and you being furious about a professor. I'd rather ask you badly than wait for a version of this that doesn't actually exist. She crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and kissed him hard enough that he nearly knocked the pan clean off the stove, which set off the smoke alarm, which meant that the actual moment of her saying yes was delivered at a shout, over the piercing wail of a $5 detector either of them had ever replaced the battery in, both of them laughing too hard to properly hear each other the first 2 times she said it. They told his sister, who cried again, louder this time. They told the old woman at the flower stall, who produced, from somewhere beneath her counter, a small dried bundle of flowers she had apparently been keeping for exactly this purpose for longer than either of them wanted to guess, and pressed it into Koneko's hands without a word of explanation. They did not, in the end, tell very many other people, because there were not very many other people to tell. A decade and a half spent half a step out of ordinary time did not leave much room for building a wide circle, and neither of them minded that as much as people who had never lived a life like theirs might expect them to. The people who mattered had always been a small, fierce, carefully kept number, and both of them had long since learned that a life built out of jumps and vanishings and impossible centuries taught you, more than almost anything else could, exactly which people were worth keeping close. Chapter 10. The wedding was small, held in early spring in a garden behind the apartment building that the landlord, unexpectedly moved by the whole story once Iseei finally told him a version of it that left out the impossible parts, offered for the day without being asked twice. It rained that morning, a light, ordinary, unremarkable rain, the kind neither of them could help but read as significant, and Koneko stood at the small archway of borrowed flowers looking, for one suspended moment, exactly as she had the very first time Iseei had seen her, fully grown, sharp-eyed and steady and entirely unafraid of anything the world had left to throw at her. His sister cried through the entire ceremony, loudly, without any apparent effort to stop. The old woman from the flower stall sat in the front row in a coat she had clearly saved for a special occasion, and nodded slowly at every vowel, as though checking each one off against some private list. Koneko's mother came too, standing at the very back beneath the shelter of an old tree, present but apart, the way she had always been, and left before the reception began, though not before Iseei caught her watching her daughter with an expression that had, for once, nothing severe in it at all. They wrote their own vows, short and plain, because both of them had, by then, spent enough of their lives inside grand and impossible things to know exactly how much simpler true things sounded when you did not dress them up. I have followed you through more centuries than I can count, Koneko said, and there has never once been a year, however strange or however far from home, where I would rather have been standing beside anyone else. I picked up something small and lost in the rain because I could not walk past it, Iseei said. I did not know, that night, that I was picking up the rest of my life. I am glad, every single day since, that I did not know, because I do not think I would have believed, back then, that I deserved to be this lucky. The rain stopped, conveniently, exactly as they finished, sunlight breaking through the clouds in the specific overdone way that would have looked absurd in any story either of them had lived themselves, and everyone laughed at the timing of it, and somewhere in the laughter Iseei caught Koneko's eye across the small garden and understood, with the same simple certainty he had felt kneeling over a shivering kitten years and centuries ago, that whatever came next, whatever jump or century or impossible year still waited somewhere ahead of them, he would rather face all of it beside her than face anything easy alone. The thread, true to her mother's word, pulled them only rarely after that, gentle unpredictable jumps months and sometimes years apart, each one a little easier to bear than the last because either of them ever again had to bear a single one of them without the other standing right there beside them, hand in hand, ready for whatever year the world decided to hand them next. Chapter 11. Married life, it turned out, did not look very different from the years that had come before it, except that now there was a ring catching the light on Koneko's hand while she argued with him about the rice, and a shared last name on the mailbox that made his sister tear up every time she visited and saw it printed there. The first jump after the wedding came almost a full year later, longer than either of them had waited and longer than they could remember, and when it finally came it was, of all things, gentle. They landed in a version of the coastline they had once stood on together before either of them had said a single true word aloud, though decades had passed there since, a small fishing village grown up along the same cliffs, and Koneko stood at the edge of it with her wedding ring catching the salt light and laughed, a real, unguarded laugh, at the strangeness of returning, married, to the exact place where she had once told him she loved him for the first time. It remembers, she said, when Iseei asked what was funny. The thread. I think it likes bringing us back to the places that mattered. I think, in its own strange way, it is proud of us. Threads don't have feelings, Iseei said, though without much conviction, because 6 years of being pulled through centuries by the thing had made him considerably less certain of what threads did and did not have. Mine does, Koneko said, with the total, settled confidence of someone who had spent her entire strange life closer to it than anyone else alive. Mine has feelings about almost everything. It has opinions about your cooking, for one. I am fairly sure that is why it keeps bringing us back to places with better food than home. They stayed in the fishing village 4 days, welcomed without much suspicion this time, in an era close enough to their own that the differences were small, comfortable ones, and Iseei found himself, on the second evening, standing at the edge of the water beside his wife, watching the sun go down over a coastline that had once shown them the beginning of the world, and thinking that there was something quietly remarkable about the fact that the strangest, most impossible thing that had ever happened to him had turned out, in the end, to be the steadiest, most ordinary thing he owned. Chapter 12. They went back to the corner where it had all started, that autumn, on the anniversary of the night in the rain. A small private tradition neither of them had ever discussed out loud and both of them had simply started doing, the way old couples build rituals without ever quite deciding to. The noodle shop was still there, under new owners now, the flower stall gone, the old woman who had run it having passed on 2 winters earlier, gently in her sleep, in the small apartment above her shop that Koneko had helped clear out afterward, finding among the woman's things a small dried bundle of flowers identical to the one she had once pressed into Kaneko's hands, and a note, written in careful old-fashioned script, that only said, "I always knew. Take care of each other." They stood at the gap between the buildings where a kitten had once huddled from the rain, and Koneko leaned her head against Iseei's shoulder the way she had learned to do somewhere in the long, slow years of growing up beside him, and neither of them said very much, because there was not, by then, very much that needed saying. "Do you ever wonder," Koneko asked eventually, "what would have happened if you had walked past me that night?" "No," Iseei said, without having to think about it at all. "I've told you before. I don't wonder about it because I already know the answer. I would have gone home to an empty apartment, and a broken lock and a life that never once had you in it, and I would never have known enough to miss it. That's not a better version of my life. That's just a version of my life I got lucky enough not to have to live." Koneko was quiet for a moment, watching the rain that had, fittingly, begun to fall again, softer this time, more like a blessing than an accident. "My mother once told me," she said, "that threads only tear loose when they are searching for something they have not found yet. I used to think that meant the thread was searching for you, for an anchor strong enough to hold." She looked up at him, eyes bright in the gray evening light, entirely unguarded, entirely certain. "I think now it might have been the other way around. I think it might have been searching for somewhere I finally belong. And it found it, that night, in the rain, in your hands, before either of us had any idea what it meant. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled, low and unhurried, the kind of sound that in any other year might have meant the world was about to fold itself away beneath their feet and drop them somewhere new, some century they had never seen, some year still waiting to test exactly how much they could carry for each other, and still come out the other side able to laugh over burned rice. It did not come, not that evening. The rain simply fell, ordinary and unremarkable, on 2 people standing exactly where a story had begun years before, hand in hand, in no hurry at all to be anywhere else. Chapter 13. Winter came, as winters do, ordinary and unremarkable, and with it the small quiet rhythms of a life either of them had ever expected to be allowed to keep. Koneko finished her degree that year, top of a class that had spent 4 semesters quietly convinced she must have some unfair advantage none of them could name, and stood at the small graduation ceremony in a gown that did not quite fit right, laughing at Iseei across the folding chairs because he had, against every promise he made her, cried harder than his own sister had. He took a new position that same winter, at a firm 2 districts over, work steady enough that for the first time in longer than either of them could properly measure, their lives ran on a calendar that mostly behaved itself. They found, slowly, the particular pleasures of an uneventful year. Sunday mornings with the whole apartment smelling of whatever Koneko had decided to attempt from a recipe book she had bought at a second-hand stall, on the grounds that a woman who had eaten across 4 centuries had opinions about food that deserved documenting. Evenings spent arguing, cheerfully, about nothing important, the dishes still settled by rock, paper, scissors, a tradition that had somehow survived a wedding entirely intact. There were harder days too, because there always are, in any real life, jump or no jump. A week Koneko spent barely speaking, caught in some private grief about a century she would not describe. That Iseei learned, eventually, simply to sit beside without pushing, the way she had once sat beside him on his own worst nights. A stretch where his old fear resurfaced without warning, some quiet midnight doubt about whether he had any right to the life he had built out of a stray kitten's misfortune, that Koneko talked him through with the same patient, faintly superior tone she had used on him since she was 7 years old, telling him he had complicated things, because some habits, it turned out, a marriage does not erase, it only deepens into something gentler. It was on one of those ordinary winter evenings, dishes done, both of them curled at opposite ends of the same couch the way they always had, closer now than they used to be, that Koneko looked up from the book she was not really reading and said, in the careful, deliberate voice she still used for things that mattered most to her, "I think the thread is going to pull again soon." Iseei set down his own book. "How soon?" "I do not know yet," she said, and then, catching his look, allowed herself a small smile, the first real one in days. "I will know when I see a calendar." It was, he realized, the exact same sentence she had said to him on a pedestrian bridge a lifetime ago, in a voice thin with fear rather than this quiet, steady calm, and the distance between those 2 sentences, spoken 11 years and one whole impossible life apart, felt to him, in that moment, like the truest measure there was of everything they had built together in between. He did not know, that evening, what year or century waited for them next, what wars or famines or strange gentle decades still lay somewhere ahead on the long unspooling length of the thread that had first torn them out of the ordinary world, and into each other's hands. He knew only that whatever it was, he would meet it the same way he had met every impossible thing since the night he crouched in the rain over something small and lost, with Koneko's hand in his, and no intention at all of letting go. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall, soft and unhurried against the window, and somewhere beneath the ordinary quiet of the apartment, deep in whatever place a thread lives when it is resting, something old and patient stirred, gathering itself, slowly, toward whatever came next. Chapter 14. The call came 3 days later, from his sister, who had taken, since the wedding, to visiting more often than either of them had space to properly prepare for, arriving with too much food and too many opinions about the state of their bookshelf, both of which Koneko had long since decided she adored rather than tolerated. "I want to tell you something before I lose my nerve," his sister said, once she had settled at the small kitchen table with tea she had made herself because she trusted neither of their pouring, "and I want you both to hear it, not just him." Koneko set down the mug she was holding, giving her full, careful attention, the same attention she gave everything that mattered. "I used to think," his sister said, "that whatever happened to the 2 of you all those years, whenever he vanished for weeks and came back with some excuse about a work trip that never quite added up, whatever it actually was, it had cost him something. He came back different, sometimes. Older, in ways that didn't match the calendar. I worried about him for years and never knew what to do with the worry because I never had the whole story." She looked between them both, her eyes bright. "I still don't have the whole story. I don't think either of you are ever going to tell me the whole story, and I've made my peace with that. But I finally understand, watching the 2 of you this past year, that whatever it cost him, it gave him you. And I don't think there's a version of my brother's life I would trade for the one where that never happened." Koneko reached across the table and took her hand, and for a while none of them said anything else, because there was nothing else that needed saying, and the winter light came in soft through the kitchen window, and the kettle ticked as it cooled, and it was, in every way that mattered, an entirely ordinary afternoon. It was later that same evening, after his sister had gone home, dishes done and the apartment quiet again, that Iseei found Koneko standing very still at the window, watching the snow, her whole body gone tense in the particular way he had learned, across more years and centuries than either of them could properly count, to recognize instantly. "It's close," she said before he could ask. "Closer than I told you. I did not want to worry you before your sister's visit." He came to stand beside her, and out past the glass the falling snow seemed, for just a moment, to hang suspended in the air rather than fall, the whole hushed white world outside going strange and still the way it always did in the seconds before the thread pulled taut. Together, he said the same word he had said before every jump since the very first one, on the bridge, when she had been small and frightened and gripping his hand hard enough to hurt. Together, Koneko agreed, and laced her fingers through his exactly the way she always had, and the apartment, the snow, the whole ordinary quiet evening, folded away around them into whatever waited next. Whatever year found them on the other side of it, whatever century or war or gentle forgotten decade the thread had decided, in its old patient way, to show them next, neither of them stepped into it as strangers to the feeling anymore. There was no small hand gripping too hard out of fear, no child bracing for a stranger's anger, no careful formal cadence testing whether each word was safe to say aloud. There was only a husband and a wife, hands laced together, meeting the unknown the way they had learned, slowly, across more than a decade of impossible years, to meet everything else that had ever come for them, side by side, unhurried, and entirely unafraid. Somewhere behind them, in the apartment they would not see again for however long this particular thread chose to keep them, the kettle sat cooling on its stand. The small stack of unfinished mail waited on the counter, and a photograph from their wedding day, still slightly crooked on its shelf, caught the last of the porch light through the window before the snow outside swallowed it whole. It would still be there when they came back. It always was. That, more than any of the strange and impossible things either of them had learned to live with, was the part Iseei had come to trust most completely. The quiet certainty that no matter how far the thread pulled them, no matter what century swallowed them whole for a week or a month or a year, there was always a way back to that small ordinary kitchen, and to each other, waiting exactly where they had left it. Chapter 1. The snow did not follow them. Iseei felt the change before he saw it, a warmth against his face that had no business existing, a heartbeat after standing at a frost-covered window, and opened his eyes to find the two of them standing in the middle of a dirt road under a sky gone hazy with heat and distant smoke. Koneko's hand was already tight around his, the way it always was in the first seconds of a landing, before she had time to gather her bearings and remember to be calm about it. Her eyes moved fast over the road, the tree line, the low rumble that Iseei's ears took another second to place, as something closer to thunder than thunder had any right to sound. "That is not weather," she said quietly. "I know. We need to be off this road." They found the tree line just as a column of dust rose along the road behind them, distant enough not to see clearly but close enough that neither of them waited to find out what it was. Koneko worked it out that evening, crouched with him in the hollow of an old drainage ditch, counting details from the little she had glimpsed, the cut of a passing uniform, the shape of a rifle slung wrong for anything either of them recognized from history books alone. "A war," she said finally. "One I do not have dated precisely yet. Somewhere in the last century, I think, though I will not know which conflict until I see a newspaper, and I do not intend to go looking for one until we are somewhere safer than a ditch. How long do we usually get, in something like this?" "I do not know," she admitted, and there was an old, familiar strain in her voice, the same one he remembered from the very first jump on the bridge, before either of them had learned to carry fear quietly instead of loudly. "Wars are the hardest to predict. The thread does not care about the difference between a quiet century and a burning one. It only cares about balance. Sometimes that means days. Sometimes it means we are here until the fighting itself decides when we leave." They spent that first night in the ditch, and the next two in the ruin of a barn whose owners had clearly left in a hurry weeks earlier, rationing food from Iseei's travel bag that had, out of long habit, been packed and ready by the apartment door for exactly this kind of landing. Koneko slept in short, watchful stretches, waking at every distant sound, and Iseei found himself, more than once, simply watching her sleep in the gray half-light, marveling at how completely the frightened child from the bridge and the sharp, capable woman curled against his shoulder now had become, somehow, without him ever noticing the exact moment of the change, the very same person. Chapter 2. They found the village on the fourth day, smaller and quieter than the road had suggested, most of its younger men long gone to whatever front the war had opened somewhere beyond the tree line, and were taken in, cautiously, by an old farmer's widow who asked no questions Koneko could not answer with some careful half-truth about displaced relatives and a family long since scattered by the fighting. It was, in its own bruised way, not unlike the mountain village from years before, a scrap of ordinary life clinging on beneath the shadow of something much larger and crueler than itself. Iseei worked the widow's small remaining field in exchange for the room in her cellar, and Koneko, once she had judged the woman trustworthy, spent her days helping with whatever the household needed, and her evenings quietly, tending to a wound on the widow's grandson's leg that had gone bad from a fall and no doctor left in the district to see to it, using knowledge Iseei suspected came from some century far beyond the one they were standing in. The boy, no older than 9, recovered within the week, and the widow wept over Koneko's hands as though they belonged to a saint rather than a stranger she had known for 11 days. "You cannot keep doing that," Iseei told her quietly, that night, in the cellar, not out of disapproval but out of the old fear he had never fully shaken, the fear of a thread pulled loose by too much changed. "Your mother's whole discipline. Watch and say nothing, do nothing, change nothing." "My mother's discipline was built for a watcher traveling alone," Koneko said, without any real defensiveness in it, only a quiet certainty that had grown steadier every year he had known her. "I am not alone anymore. I have not been alone in a very long time. And I have decided, somewhere along the way, that I would rather be the kind of watcher who occasionally changes a small thread for the better than the kind who lets a child die of an infected leg because a rule written centuries before either of us existed told her to look away." She met his eyes, steady in the dim cellar light. "You did not walk past me in the rain. I am not going to walk past the boy with a bad leg because it is inconvenient for the discipline. I would rather answer for that, if I ever have to answer for it at all, than live with the alternative." He did not argue with her. He had, if he was honest, stopped being able to argue with that particular version of her logic somewhere around the 11th year he had known her, and had come, slowly, to admire it far more than he feared it. Chapter 3. The thread pulled them free on the 16th day, in the middle of the night, without warning, the cellar and the widow's small farmhouse folding away around them mid-breath the way it always did, and they landed, disoriented and blinking, back in their own apartment, the kettle exactly where Iseei had left it, the crooked wedding photograph still catching the porch light through the window. It took them 3 days to stop flinching at loud sounds. It took Koneko longer than that to stop waking in the night convinced she could still hear the distant thunder that had not, in fact, been thunder. "I keep thinking about the boy," she admitted, one of those nights, curled against Iseei's side rather than at the far end of the couch, a habit that had become, over the years, simply where she slept rather than a milestone either of them remarked on anymore. "I will never know what happened to him. Whether the leg healed properly. Whether the war reached that village before it ended. I changed his thread and then the world pulled me away before I ever got to see what the change became. That's true of almost everyone we've ever met, in every year," Iseei said gently. "The tea-house owner's wife. The mountain village. All of them. We only ever get a piece of anyone's story." "I know," Koneko said. "I have had a very long time to make my peace with that particular ache, and most days I do not think about it at all." She was quiet a moment, and then, in a smaller voice, the kind she rarely let him hear any more, she added, "I think it frightens me more now than it used to. Before, it was only ever my own life I was afraid of losing pieces of. Now it is yours too, and I do not know if I would survive losing a piece of you the same careless way the thread takes everything else from us." Iseei held her a little tighter and did not offer her any easy answer, because there was not, honestly, an easy one to give, and because he had learned, across more than a decade beside her, that the truest comfort he had to offer was very rarely a solution, and very often simply the fact of staying. Chapter 4. Life steadied again, the way it always eventually did, ordinary days stacking gently on top of each other until the war-torn village became a story they told carefully, on quiet evenings, rather than a wound either of them still actively carried. It was Koneko who noticed, that spring, that something had changed in her that had nothing to do with the thread at all. A stillness in her mornings, a sudden fierce aversion to a tea she had drunk happily for years, and she sat very quietly at the kitchen table one Sunday with a small folded piece of paper in her hand for a long time before she finally called Iseei in from the other room. He did not, in that first frozen moment, trust himself to say anything at all. "I did not think this was something that happened to watchers," Koneko said, and there was wonder in her voice under the caution, an old fear finally giving way to something entirely new. "My mother never spoke of it." I do not know if it is even meant to be possible, a thread and an anchor, a child that belongs to both worlds at once. Does it scare you? Everything about our life scares me a little, Koneko said, with the small dry honesty that had never once left her, even after everything. It has scared me since the night you picked me up in the rain. I have simply gotten very good, over the years, at being frightened and happy about the same thing at exactly the same time. She looked up at him, eyes bright. I am terrified, and I do not think I have ever wanted anything more in my entire long strange life. Chapter 5. The pregnancy, as it turned out, unsettled the thread in ways either of them had anticipated, jumps growing rarer still, as though whatever old patient intelligence guided it had, of its own accord, decided to grant them a longer season of stillness than it ever had before. Kaneko's mother came once during those months, quieter than her first visit, watching her daughter with an expression that mixed her usual careful reserve with something that looked, for the first time Iseei had ever seen, almost unguarded. It has happened before, she said, when Koneko finally worked up the courage to ask her directly. Rarely. Perhaps once in 100 generations of our line. A child born to a watcher and an anchor carries something either parent carries alone, a foot planted properly in one world and a thread still tied loose to every other. It will not be an easy life for the child. But then, and here something almost like a smile crossed her severe face, I do not believe either of you have ever wanted the easy version of anything. She left them, that visit, with a small gift Koneko would not describe to Iseei in detail, only that it was old, and quiet, and meant, her mother said, to be given to the child herself one day, when she was old enough to understand what it was for. The months that followed were, against every expectation either of them had built across a decade of impossible years, almost entirely ordinary. Iseei painted a small room at the end of the hallway a soft, undecided color either of them could ever quite agree was blue or green. Koneko finished a translation project she had been picking at for months, working from a stack of very old, very fragile books her mother had left with her on that same visit. They argued gently about names across 3 different centuries' worth of options Koneko had catalogued in her head, and settled, eventually, without much drama, on one that belonged to either of their families and felt, somehow, exactly right for a child who would belong, from the very beginning, to more than one world at once. Chapter 6. Their daughter was born on an ordinary Thursday in late autumn, in an ordinary hospital 2 districts from the apartment, with none of the strangeness either of them had half braced for. Only the entirely universal chaos of a first birth, Iseei white-knuckled and useless in exactly the way every father before him had been useless, Koneko furious and magnificent, and, at the very end of it, laughing through exhausted tears at the sheer mundane miracle of a very small, very loud, very ordinary-looking baby. They named her Hannah, a name that had won out, in the end, over every century's worth of alternatives Koneko had catalogued. Simply because it was the name of the flower the old woman from the stall had once pressed, dried and silent, into Koneko's hands, and because some threads, Koneko said, deserved to be tied on purpose rather than left to the accident of a jump. Hannah had her mother's sharp, watchful eyes from the very first week, a fact the hospital nurses commented on more than once, unaware of exactly how right they were, and Iseei found himself, in those first exhausted, overwhelmed months, thinking often of the night in the rain, of a small shivering shape he had almost walked past, and marveling at the particular, impossible arithmetic that had led from that ordinary evening to this one, to a small warm way to sleep against his chest at 3 in the morning while snow gathered again outside the window, a full turn of the year later. The thread stayed quiet through all of it, months and then most of a year passing in the kind of unremarkable, treasured ordinariness either of them had ever fully believed they would be allowed to keep. Koneko's mother visited twice more that first year, watching her granddaughter with an intensity that made Koneko nervous the first time and, by the second visit, only made her smile, recognizing in it the same fierce, careful love her mother had always shown in the only language she fully knew how to speak it. Chapter 7. It was Hannah's first birthday, of all days, when the thread pulled again, sudden and unannounced. The small apartment full of half-deflated balloons and the last of a cake folding away around all 3 of them at once, mid-celebration, into somewhere entirely new. Koneko's arms tightened around her daughter before her eyes had even finished adjusting to the change in light. Iseei, I'm here. I'm right here. They had landed in a wide stone courtyard, unmistakably old, unmistakably foreign in a way that made Koneko's breath catch even before she had gathered enough of her bearings to place it. Columns rising on every side under a sky far bluer and far hotter than the one they had left. A language rising around them from a dozen directions that neither of them recognized at all. It was the furthest back either of them had ever landed with a child in tow, and Koneko's careful composure cracked, for just a moment, into something close to panic. Before Iseei caught her free hand and held it, the same steady grip he had offered on a pedestrian bridge a lifetime ago. Together, he said. Same as always. We figure it out together. It took her longer than usual, that time, to calculate exactly how far the thread had thrown them, distracted as she was by a fussing, overtired, thoroughly unimpressed 1-year-old who had, it turned out, extremely strong opinions about being pulled through several thousand years of history in the middle of her own birthday cake. They survived it, in the end, the way they had survived every other impossible landing before it, through caution and quiet and the same careful invisibility Koneko had spent a lifetime perfecting, though this time with the added, terrifying weight of a child too young to understand why she needed to stay silent, hidden for 2 frightening days in the shadow of a market stall until Koneko's rough grasp of an ancient dialect, cobbled together from a decade of libraries, was enough to buy them safe passage out of the city and somewhere quieter to wait out the thread's mercy. Chapter 8. It was during those quiet, tense days, sheltering in a borrowed room above a potter's workshop, that they first understood exactly how much more dangerous the thread had become since Hana's birth. It is not random anymore, Koneko said late one night, Hana finally asleep between them, her small chest rising and falling in the lamplight. I have been tracking every jump since she was born. They used to follow a pattern, however strange. This one broke every rule I ever learned. It should not have been able to reach this far back with 3 of us anchored together. A thread that strong pulling that hard, that suddenly, is not simply searching for balance anymore. Something else is pulling at it. Something else, meaning what? Koneko did not answer right away, and when she did, her voice had gone careful in the specific way it always did when she was choosing, deliberately, how much fear to let him see. There are others like me, she said finally. Watchers who did not stay loyal to the discipline. Some of them learned, over the centuries, that a thread can be pulled on purpose, not just followed. That an anchor bound tightly enough to a watcher can be used, if someone with the right knowledge wanted to use it, as a kind of door. She looked down at their sleeping daughter. I do not know for certain that is what happened tonight. But I have begun to suspect, for a while now, that this thread has stopped being an accident we are simply enduring, and started being something someone else has taken an interest in. Chapter 9. They made it home 11 days later, exhausted, shaken, and profoundly grateful, and Koneko spent the following weeks buried in her mother's old books with an intensity Iseei had not seen in her since the very earliest years of their strange life together, searching for anything that might confirm or disprove the fears she had spoken aloud only once, in a lamplit room above a potter's workshop, and had not fully spoken of since. Her mother, when finally asked directly, did not deny it outright, which frightened Iseei more than an outright denial would have. There have always been those among us who believe the discipline was a cage rather than a duty, she said, sitting very still in their small living room, Hana asleep in her lap, her severe face unreadable in the way it only ever became when she was weighing exactly how much truth a conversation could bear. Most of them are old stories now, cautionary ones, told to young watchers to frighten them into obedience. But old stories persist for a reason. I do not know, with certainty, that your thread has drawn unwanted attention. I know only that a thread strong enough to carry a child, forged between a watcher and an anchor who love each other as deeply as the two of you plainly do, would be exactly the kind of thread such people have always coveted most. Coveted for what? Iseei asked, though some old, wary part of him had already begun to guess. For its strength, Koneko's mother said simply. A thread like yours does not merely travel through time. Given the right hand to guide it, and the wrong intentions behind that hand, it could be made to hold a door open far longer than any thread was ever meant to hold one. Long enough for things that ought never cross between eras freely to cross them anyway. Chapter 10. They did not tell Hana any of it, of course, not yet, not for years, and the ordinary rhythm of their days went on around the fear the way ordinary days always insist on doing. Because a toddler does not stop needing breakfast or bath time or an exhausted, off-key lullaby simply because her parents have discovered that something ancient and patient might be circling the edges of their family's very existence. But Iseei began, without either of them discussing it directly, to notice small changes in how Koneko carried herself, a new watchfulness at the edges of ordinary days, a careful, deliberate teaching that crept into even their smallest routines, showing Hannah, far too young to understand why, how to stay very still and very quiet, turning it, gently, into a kind of game rather than a warning. "I do not want her to grow up frightened," Koneko said one evening, after Hannah had finally gone down for the night, the two of them alone at the kitchen table with a pot of tea gone cold between them. "I grew up frightened, in my own way, my whole childhood built around watching and never touching, never changing, never being seen. I do not want that for her. But I also cannot pretend I do not see what might be coming for us, and I would rather she learn how to survive it early and gently than learn it suddenly, the way I once had to." Iseei reached across the table and took her hand, the same steady grip he had been offering her since a pedestrian bridge a lifetime ago, since a mountain village, since a cliff at the edge of the world, since every single impossible year that had come between then and now. "Whatever is coming," he said, "it's going to have to go through both of us to get to her. And I like our odds a great deal better now than I would have liked them the night I picked up a shivering kitten in the rain, because now there are two of us who have spent a decade learning exactly how to survive anything a thread decides to throw at us." Koneko managed, finally, something close to her old steady smile. "Three of us," she corrected softly, glancing toward the small room at the end of the hallway, still painted a color either of them could quite agree was blue or green. "Do not forget to count her. She is going to be far more trouble than either of us ever were, and I suspect she is going to be the reason we survive whatever comes next, not simply the reason we have to." Chapter 11. The warning, when it finally came, arrived in the most ordinary way imaginable, a stranger at the door on a wet Tuesday evening, an old man with Koneko's same watchful eyes and none of her warmth, who introduced himself only as a watcher of the old discipline and asked, with unsettling politeness, to be let in out of the rain. Koneko did not let him pass the threshold. She stood in the doorway with Hannah on her hip, her whole body gone very still in the way Iseei had learned, across a decade, meant she was more afraid than she would ever admit aloud. "I know who sent you," she said. "Then you know I am not here to threaten you," the old man said. "I am here because the ones who did send interest your way are not so patient as I am, and I would rather you hear a warning from someone who still remembers the discipline than learn the truth of it the hard way, as I once did myself." He told them, standing in the rain on their own doorstep, refusing every offer to come in out of it, that a faction within the oldest surviving watchers, scattered across centuries and bound by an ambition older than either Koneko or her mother, had been tracking threads like theirs for generations, waiting for one strong enough, forged deep enough between an anchor and a watcher who had built a true life together, to serve their purpose. A door held open long enough, guided by the right hand, could do more than move two people through history. It could, in the wrong hands, be widened, made permanent, turned into a crossing point far larger than any single thread was ever meant to bear. "They have been patient for a very long time," the old man said. "But patience runs out, eventually, even for people who have all of history to draw on. I believe they intend to move soon. I do not know exactly how, or exactly when. I know only that a thread with a child bound into it, a thread carrying 3 lives instead of 2, is stronger than almost anything they have found in generations, and that strength is exactly the kind of thing such people cannot resist reaching for." He left before either of them could ask him anything further, vanishing into the rain the ordinary way, on foot, around the corner of the building, and neither of them slept much at all that night. Chapter 12. The next jump came only 4 days later, faster than any interval they had lived through in years, and this time there was no gentle unfolding, no ordinary kitchen dissolving quietly around them. There was only a sudden, violent wrenching, Koneko crying out in pain she had never once shown during any jump before, Hannah screaming in her arms, and a landing so rough it knocked all 3 of them to the ground. They were somewhere gray and formless, a place that did not look like any century Koneko had ever described to him, mist rolling low across ground that felt, beneath his hands, wrong in a way he could not have named, too smooth, too cold, like standing on the surface of something that was pretending very hard to be earth. "This is not a real landing," Koneko said, hauling herself up. Hana clutched tight against her chest, her voice thin with the fear Iseei had rarely heard in it. This is not the thread finding balance. Someone pulled us here. Someone reached in and pulled. A figure emerged from the mist before either of them could decide what to do about that. A woman, tall and composed, wearing the same kind of watchful, ancient eyes as the old man from their doorstep, though everything warm the old man's eyes had carried was entirely absent from hers. You have built something remarkable, the woman said, studying them both with open, clinical interest, her gaze lingering longest on Hana. A thread with a true anchor. A true bond. A child born into it, strengthening it further than I believed possible in a single generation. It would be a waste to let it continue drifting to no purpose, don't you think, when it could finally be put to use? Whoever you are, Iseei said, stepping instinctively between the woman and his family, you are not touching either of them. The woman smiled, entirely unbothered. I do not need to touch them, she said. I only need the thread to hold still long enough, and it seems, from where I am standing, that it is already doing exactly that. Chapter 13. What happened next would take Koneko years to fully explain to Hana. Once Hana was old enough to be told any of it at all, and even then she would never manage to make the telling sound as frightening as it had actually been, standing in that gray formless place with her daughter clutched against her chest and her husband placed, without hesitation, between his family and a stranger who spoke of them the way a jeweler speaks of a particularly promising stone. Koneko did the only thing her mother's decades of discipline had ever truly prepared her for. She reached, not outward at the woman, but inward, toward the thread itself, toward the place deep inside her where the pull of it had always lived, and did something no watcher of the old, obedient discipline had ever dared attempt. She fought it. Not the woman, the thread itself, the raw ancient current of it, wrestling for control of a thing that had, until that moment, only ever pulled her wherever it chose. It cost her. Iseei would see it in her for days afterward, a thinness in her face, a tremor in her hands she tried and failed to hide, the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent every reserve of strength she carried in a single desperate act. But it worked. The mist tore, violent and sudden, the gray formless ground buckling beneath them, and the woman's composed expression cracked, for the first time, into something like genuine alarm, as the thread, wrenched briefly back under Koneko's control, pulled all three of them free and away, out of whatever ancient, artificial crossing point the woman had built, and flung them, hard, back toward the world they had come from. They landed in their own kitchen in a heap, Hana wailing, Koneko gasping, Iseei's ears ringing with the aftershock of it, and for a long moment none of them moved at all, simply breathing, simply alive, simply, impossibly home. Chapter 14. Koneko slept for nearly a full day afterward, the deepest, most complete sleep Iseei had ever seen her fall into, and woke, finally, pale and drained but entirely herself, gathering Hana into her arms the moment she was steady enough to sit up, and holding her so tightly the toddler squirmed in mild protest. I do not know how long that will hold them off, Koneko admitted, once Hana had wriggled free to go chase something imaginary across the living room floor, blessedly, mercifully unaware of how close the last 4 days had come to costing her everything. What I did back there, fighting the thread directly, it is not something any watcher is meant to be capable of. My mother never taught it to me because I do not believe she knows it herself. I do not fully know how I did it either. I only knew I would rather burn out every last thing I have than let that woman near either of you. Can you do it again if you have to? I do not know, Koneko said honestly. I suspect it will cost more, the second time. Perhaps considerably more. She was quiet a moment, watching her daughter through the doorway, small and fierce and utterly unaware of the world that had nearly claimed her. But I would pay it. Every single time, whatever it costs, I would pay it, for either of you, without a moment's hesitation. Iseei's sister came the following weekend, unaware of any of it, full of ordinary chatter about a promotion at work and a recipe she wanted Koneko's opinion on, and Iseei found himself, watching her fuss happily over Hana at the kitchen table, achingly grateful for every ordinary, unremarkable thing about the visit, for a world that still had room, somehow, for aunts and recipes and Sunday afternoons, even after everything. Chapter 15. They did not tell Iseei's sister any of it, and they did not, for a long while, tell Koneko's mother either. Though she came to visit within the month and took one long look at her daughter's still faintly hollowed eyes and understood, without needing a single word explained, exactly what had happened. "You did something no watcher of my generation would have believed possible," she said quietly. Once Hannah had been put down for her nap and the three adults sat together in the small living room. "I do not know whether to be proud of you or terrified for you. I find, examining it honestly, that I am both, in roughly equal measure." "Will they try again?" Iseei asked. "Almost certainly," Koneko's mother said, with the same blunt honesty she had always offered them, even when it was not what either of them wanted to hear. "They have waited generations for a thread like this one. A single failed attempt will not be enough to make people that patient give up. But they will be more cautious now, knowing what your daughter is capable of, and caution buys time. Time enough, perhaps, to prepare properly for whatever comes next, rather than being caught the way you were caught this time." She stayed 3 days, that visit, longer than she ever had before, teaching Koneko, in quiet hours after Hannah had gone to bed, pieces of the old discipline that had never been meant for a watcher living openly, bonded to a family, raising a child instead of watching alone from the shadows of 100 separate centuries. It was not, Iseei understood, watching them work late into each night, a mother teaching a daughter simply out of duty anymore. It was, plainly and for the first time in either of their long complicated lives, something closer to two women preparing, together, for a fight neither of them intended to lose. By the time she left, Hannah had grown attached enough to her grandmother's visits to cry at the door when she vanished the ordinary way, and Koneko stood watching the empty space where her mother had been, one hand resting light and protective on her daughter's shoulder, the other laced through Iseei's, and something in her posture, Iseei noticed, had changed since the gray formless place. Some old careful fear finally hardened into something steadier, something closer to resolve. "Whatever they send next," Koneko said quietly, "they are going to find out exactly how much stronger a thread gets, when the people bound into it have already decided, every one of them, that they would rather die fighting for each other than ever be pulled apart." Chapter 16. Life did not stop for the fear, the way it never had before, and the months that followed folded themselves into a strange new rhythm. Ordinary days lived carefully, watchfully, alongside a quiet, determined preparation neither of them discussed in front of Hannah but neither of them ever fully set aside either. Koneko trained in the evenings, in the small space they cleared in the living room once Hannah was asleep, working through pieces of the old discipline her mother had left her with, learning, slowly and at real cost, how to reach for the thread on purpose rather than simply endure wherever it chose to take her. Iseei, unable to do anything about the thread itself, found his own way to be useful, learning, from Koneko's careful instruction, how to read the warning signs of a jump before it fully arrived, how to move quickly, how to keep Hannah calm and quiet in the crucial seconds before a landing settled, small practical skills that would not save them from a determined enemy but might, at least, buy the family precious seconds if the enemy ever came again. Hannah grew through all of it, the way children do, oblivious to the shadow hanging over her small ordinary life, learning to talk in the specific stubborn way that made her parents laugh helplessly even in their most anxious moments, learning to walk and then to run, learning, without either parent teaching her directly, an unnerving instinct for going very still and very quiet whenever the air in a room changed in the particular way that preceded a jump, an instinct Koneko watched develop with equal parts pride and heartbreak. She should not have to know how to do that, Koneko said once, watching her 2-year-old daughter freeze, silent and alert, seconds before a minor, ultimately harmless jump pulled the whole family briefly and gently into a decade only 40 years removed from their own. She is a baby. She should be worrying about nap time, not about staying quiet enough to survive. She's not just a baby, Iseei said gently. She's ours. And I think somewhere in that fierce little head of hers she already understands that staying quiet is just another way of taking care of us. The same way you decided, at 7 years old, that protecting me was your job even though I was supposed to be the one protecting you. Chapter 17. The second attempt came nearly a year after the first, on an evening that gave no warning at all, no wrenching pain, no violent tearing of the thread, only a quiet, careful pull that Koneko, for the first time, felt coming and recognized instantly for what it was. "It is them," she said, going very still in the middle of making dinner, one hand already reaching for Hannah. "They have learned from last time. They are not trying to force the thread anymore. They are trying to guide it gently enough that I will not feel it happening until it is already done. Can you stop it? I do not know, Koneko admitted, already moving, gathering Hana against her chest, catching Iseei's hand with her free one, the three of them drawing close together instinctively even before the pull fully took hold. But I am not facing it alone this time, the way I did before. Whatever happens, we face it together, the same as always. The landing, when it came, was gentler than the last, though no less unwelcome, depositing them once again in a place that felt wrong beneath Iseei's feet, though this time softer, greener, a strange twilight garden full of flowers that did not quite match any species he had ever seen, the mist here silver rather than gray, and the woman who stepped out of it, when she came, wore a different face than before, though Koneko recognized the same cold, patient intent in her eyes immediately. You survived our first attempt, the woman said, studying them with open curiosity rather than the clinical interest of before. Admirably so, in fact. It has made you something of a curiosity, among those I answer to. A watcher who fights the thread rather than obeys it. An anchor who stands his ground rather than flees. A child who has learned, so young, to make herself invisible on instinct alone. Her gaze settled on Hana, and something in it sharpened. It occurs to us that perhaps the child herself is the true prize here, not the thread at all. A watcher's gift, inherited this early, this strongly, bound this deeply to a stable anchor. She could be shaped into something far more useful to us than either of her parents ever were. Chapter 18. Something in Koneko broke open at that, not the exhausted desperate strength of the first confrontation, but something colder, steadier, entirely more dangerous, and Iseei watched his wife step forward, putting herself fully between the woman and their daughter, with an expression he had genuinely never seen on her face before, not fear, not even fury exactly, but something closer to absolute, unshakable resolve. You will not touch her, Koneko said, and her voice, when it came, did not shake at all. You will not touch either of them. I have spent every day since the night I fell into this man's hands in the rain learning exactly what I am willing to fight for, and I promise you, whatever discipline you have spent centuries mastering, whatever ancient patient plan you and yours have built, none of it has prepared you for a mother standing between you and her child. She reached for the thread again, the way she had the first time, but differently now, more deliberately, drawing not just on her own desperate strength but on months of careful, deliberate training, on everything her own mother had taught her in 3 long nights of quiet, urgent instruction, and this time, when she pulled, the thread answered her more fully, more completely, the silver mist tearing wide open around all 3 of them. The woman's composed expression finally, fully cracked, alarm breaking through the cold interest at last, as Koneko drove the thread not just to pull them free but to slam shut, hard and absolute, whatever careful crossing point the woman and her allies had spent so long constructing, a door closing with enough force that Iseei felt it in his own chest, a pressure like the whole world exhaling at once. They landed back in their own kitchen in a heap again, the way they had before, but this time Koneko did not simply gasp and shake. This time she looked, for one fierce, triumphant moment, entirely unafraid, before the exhaustion of what she had done finally caught up with her, and she sank, slowly, gratefully, into Iseei's waiting arms, Hana clutched safe and unharmed between them both. Chapter 19. The old man returned 3 weeks later, on another wet evening, and this time Koneko let him in. She closed the door, he said, settling into a chair with the careful, tired relief of someone delivering news he had genuinely feared he might never get to deliver. Word has already spread, among those still loyal to the old discipline. A thread that can be sealed against them is not a thread worth the risk of pursuing further, not when there are other, less costly threads elsewhere in history for them to chase instead. I do not believe they will trouble your family again. Not soon. Perhaps not ever, if you are fortunate. And if we are not fortunate, Koneko asked, then you have already proven, twice over, that you are far more capable of defending yourselves than they ever accounted for, the old man said, with something that might, on a face less weathered, have passed for a smile. I have watched threads like yours for longer than either of you have been alive, in whatever way you choose to measure a life. I have rarely seen one fought for so fiercely, by so many hands at once, an anchor, a watcher, a grandmother who broke her own careful discipline to teach her daughter something forbidden, And a small girl too young to understand the danger and brave anyway simply because her parents asked it of her. That is not the kind of thread easily unraveled by anyone, however old or however patient. He left again the way he always did, into the ordinary rain, and this time, watching him go, either Iseei nor Koneko felt the same cold dread that had followed his first visit. There was only, finally, something that felt, cautiously, dearly, like the beginning of an actual peace. Chapter 20. The jumps grew rare again after that, months and then most of a year passing in careful, treasured stillness, and Hannah grew alongside that stillness the way children do, into a fierce, curious, entirely ordinary little girl who loved burned rice exactly as much as her father secretly did, and argued with her mother about bedtime with the same stubborn, delighted confidence Koneko had once used to argue about the dishes. There were scars left behind, the way there always are after a fight worth having. Koneko still woke some nights from dreams of gray mist and silver gardens, and Iseei still, on certain evenings, found himself watching the apartment door a beat too long after the wind rattled it unexpectedly. But the scars sat alongside an equal, steady certainty either of them had fully possessed before the fight came for them, the hard-won knowledge that whatever the thread, or history, or anyone patient and ancient and cruel enough to covet it ever tried to take from them, they had already proven, more than once, exactly how much they were willing to give in order to keep each other. It was on an ordinary evening, Hannah finally asleep, the two of them curled together on the same worn couch that had carried them through every quiet year of their strange life, that Koneko rested her head against Iseei's shoulder and said softly, into the comfortable dark, "I used to think the thread was the most important thing that ever happened to me, the reason I fell into your life in the first place." She was quiet a moment, listening to the ordinary hum of the apartment around them, the radiator ticking, the distant sound of traffic outside. "I do not think that anymore. I think the thread was only ever the excuse. I think you would have found some way to become the most important thing in my life even without it, and I am simply grateful, every single day, that it happened to be the thread that finally brought us to each other, instead of making us wait even longer than we already had to." Outside, the first stars came out over the city, ordinary and unremarkable and entirely their own, and somewhere far beneath the quiet of the apartment, deep in whatever place a thread rests when it has, for now, found its balance at last, something old and patient settled, gently, and waited, in no hurry at all, for whatever came next. Chapter 21. Koneko's mother came for Hannah's third birthday, a small quiet gathering that included, for the first time, the old man from the doorway, invited at Koneko's own insistence. A gesture that surprised him so plainly he nearly declined before Hannah herself, entirely unbothered by centuries of old discipline or ancient rivalries, marched up and demanded he help her blow out her candles. "She has no idea what you are," Iseei's sister said later, watching the old man laugh, genuinely and without reservation, at something Hannah had said, an easy warmth on his weathered face that Iseei suspected very few people in any century had ever been lucky enough to see. "She just thinks he's Grandma's friend." "That's exactly what he is, to her," Koneko said, watching the two of them with quiet satisfaction. "I decided a long time ago that I did not want my daughter's childhood built entirely out of secrets and careful half-truths, the way mine was. She will learn the rest of it, in time, when she is old enough to carry it properly. For now, she gets birthday cake and an old man who lets her boss him around. I think that is exactly the childhood she deserves." It was, watching the small gathering spread across their living room, easy to forget, for an afternoon, everything that had come before it, the gray mist, the silver garden, the two desperate fights that had nearly cost them everything. There was only cake, and badly wrapped presents, and Hannah's delighted shriek when her grandmother produced, from somewhere beneath her coat, a small stuffed cat toy that looked, Iseei realized with a startled laugh, uncannily like the shape Koneko herself had once worn, curled and gray and small, in the gap between a noodle shop and a flower stall on a rainy night neither of them would ever forget. Chapter 22. The years that followed folded gently into each other, the way years finally do once the worst of a storm has passed through and left only ordinary weather behind. Hannah started school, made friends with the specific fierce loyalty her mother had always shown, came home most days with some new opinion about the world that made both her parents laugh helplessly at the dinner table. The jumps, when they came at all, arrived gently now, brief and manageable, the thread having settled, at last, into something closer to the quiet rhythm Koneko's mother had once promised it would find. There were harder days woven through the easy ones, the way there are in any real life. A jump that stranded them, briefly, in a decade hostile enough that Koneko's old caution resurfaced in full force, teaching Hana, gently but firmly, the rules of staying invisible in a world that did not welcome strangers kindly. A night, when Hana was 6, that she woke from a nightmare about gray mist she should have been far too young to remember any real version of, and Koneko sat with her until dawn, murmuring the same patient reassurances her own mother had never quite known how to offer her, breaking, happily, a pattern that had held for generations before her. Iseei watched his wife, across those years, grow into a version of herself he suspected even her own mother had never fully imagined possible, fierce and steady and entirely unafraid. A watcher who had rewritten, through sheer stubborn love, half the rules she had once been taught were unbreakable, and found himself, more often than he ever admitted aloud, simply grateful, in the quiet, unremarkable middle of an ordinary evening, for the small shivering shape he had almost walked past in the rain all those years and centuries ago. Chapter 23. It was on a quiet evening in early spring, dishes done, Hana long since asleep down the hall, that Koneko looked up from the book she was not really reading and said, in the same careful, deliberate voice she always used for things that mattered most, "I think it is time to start telling her more. Not everything. Not yet, but enough that she understands what she carries, before it surprises her the way it once surprised me." Iseei set down his own book, giving her his full attention the way he always had, across every year and every impossible century that had brought them here. "Are you ready for that?" "No," Koneko admitted, with the small honest smile that had never once left her, even after everything. "I do not think any parent is ever fully ready to hand their child a truth that large. But I have learned, across a very long strange life, that readiness is not usually the thing that decides when a truth needs telling. The thread decides that. It always has." She reached across the space between them and laced her fingers through his, the same gesture she had made on a bridge, on a cliff, on a wedding day, in a gray formless place where she had fought harder than either of them had ever known she could. "Whatever comes next, whatever she becomes once she understands the whole of what she carries, I would rather she learn it from us, gently, in her own time, than learn it the hard way, alone, the way I very nearly did." Outside, the last of the winter frost was finally giving way to something warmer, and somewhere down the hall their daughter slept soundly, safe and unafraid, carrying inside her, quietly, patiently, a thread that had already survived more than most threads ever would, waiting, in its own old and unhurried way, for whatever chapter of her own life it had decided, long ago, to write for her next. Chapter 24. They told her in pieces, over the following months, the way Koneko had promised, starting small, on an ordinary Saturday morning, with nothing more than the truth that her mother was not, strictly, born the same way other mothers were, that she had once been very small and very lost and had found her way, through means Hana was still too young to fully understand, into the arms of the father who had never once let her go since. Hana took it, in the specific way only a child raised already half surrounded by careful, loving strangeness can take a truth like that, with far less shock than either parent had braced for and far more curiosity, peppering Koneko with questions for the better part of an hour. Most of them about whether being a kitten had involved eating actual mice, a question Koneko answered, laughing despite herself, with rather more honesty than Iseei expected. The larger truths came slower, over seasons rather than days, offered carefully, in pieces sized exactly to what a child of 6, then 7, then 8 could hold without being frightened by the weight of it. The thread. The jumps. The quiet, careful disciplined Koneko had spent a lifetime both learning and, in her own way, gently rebuilding. Hana absorbed each piece the way she absorbed everything, with a fierce, matter-of-fact seriousness that made her parents proud and unsettled in roughly equal measure. A child already halfway to understanding that her own life was built on a foundation stranger, and older than anything her classmates could imagine. They did not tell her, not yet, about the gray mist or the silver garden, about the 2 desperate fights that had once nearly cost the family everything. That truth, Koneko decided, could wait a while longer still, until Hana was old enough to carry the fear of it alongside the pride, and Iseei, watching his daughter grow steadily braver and steadier with every gentler truth she was given, found himself trusting his wife's judgment on the timing of it completely, the way he had trusted her judgment on nearly everything, for nearly as long as he had known her. It was on Hannah's 9th birthday, candles freshly blown out, cake half eaten, the small apartment full of the particular happy chaos only a child's birthday can produce, that the air in the room changed, all at once, in the old familiar way either parent needed to explain aloud anymore. Hannah went still first, faster than either of her parents, her small shoulders squaring in a gesture so exactly like her mother's that Iseei felt his breath catch even in the middle of his own rising alarm. She did not cry out. She did not reach for either of them in panic. She simply turned, calm and steady, and held out both her hands, one toward her mother and one toward her father, the way she had been taught, gently, patiently, across years of careful small lessons disguised as games. Together, she said, in a voice that carried, unmistakably, the same steady certainty Iseei had first heard from her mother on a bridge a lifetime ago, and had heard, every single time since, before every jump that had ever come for them. Koneko took her daughter's hand, and then Iseei's, the three of them standing linked together in the middle of a half-eaten birthday cake, and for one suspended moment, before the apartment folded away around them into whatever waited next, Iseei looked at his wife and his daughter, at the whole impossible, ordinary, hard-won family the rain and the thread in every century between had somehow conspired to give him, and felt, more strongly than he had ever felt anything in his entire strange life, that whatever year or century found them on the other side of this jump, they would meet it exactly the way they had always met everything, side by side, unafraid, and entirely unwilling to let go of one another. The apartment vanished around them, candles and cake and all, and somewhere ahead, patient and old and utterly indifferent to birthdays, a new chapter of the thread's long unspooling story waited to begin. They landed, all three together, in a place none of them recognized, though for the first time in a jump that included their daughter, none of them landed afraid. Hannah's hand stayed steady in her mother's grip. Koneko's eyes moved fast and calm over their new surroundings, cataloging details the way she always had, out of habit rather than panic. Iseei kept his footing, kept his family close, and waited, the way he always had, for his wife to tell him which century had decided to claim them this time. I do not recognize this one, Koneko admitted after a long moment, studying the strange architecture rising around them, unlike anything in any of her mother's old books. Not fully. There are pieces of it that feel familiar, and pieces that do not feel like any era I have ever studied at all. She looked down at Hannah, who was watching the unfamiliar skyline with wide, fascinated eyes rather than fear, and something in her mother's face softened, proud and a little awed at once. It is possible, Koneko said slowly, that this is not a place the thread has ever taken anyone before. It is possible we are somewhere entirely new. Is that bad? Hannah asked, with the same blunt practicality she brought to everything. I do not think so, Koneko said, and glanced at Iseei, something bright and unafraid passing between them, the same look they had first shared on a pedestrian bridge a lifetime ago, when neither of them had any idea yet what they were about to build together out of nothing but fear and stubborn care. I think it might simply mean the thread still has more to teach us. It usually does, just when we think we have learned everything it has to offer. Iseei took his daughter's other hand, and the three of them stood together at the edge of whatever unmapped century had opened itself to receive them, unhurried, unafraid, ready, the way they always had been since the very beginning, to meet it exactly as a family. Somewhere far behind them, back in an ordinary apartment with an unfinished cake still sitting on the counter, a thread continued its long, patient, unspooling work, gathering itself, slowly, toward whatever came after this. Koneko's mother would tell them, much later, once they had finally made their way home again and pieced together for her everything they had seen in that unmapped, unfamiliar century, that in all her long life of watching threads unravel and reweave themselves across 1,000 ordinary and impossible years, she had never once heard of a thread finding a place that did not already exist somewhere in the recorded span of history. It troubled her, in the quiet, careful way most things troubled her, though she did her best not to let that trouble show in front of her granddaughter. It is possible, she said finally, turning the strange, unfamiliar details over in her mind the way she turned over everything, slowly and with great care, that your thread has grown strong enough now to reach beyond what any of us understood its limits to be. Whether that is a gift or a warning, I cannot yet say. I have lived a very long time, and I confess I do not know everything there is to know about a thread this determined to keep finding new places to carry the people bound into it. It was not, I understood, an answer meant to reassure them, and it did not. But it was, he had learned across every strange and impossible year of his life beside Koneko, the kind of honest uncertainty that mattered more than easy comfort ever could, the kind that told them, plainly, that whatever came next was going to ask more of all three of them than anything the thread had asked before. Hannah, for her part, seemed entirely unbothered by the uncertainty, already peppering her grandmother with eager questions about the strange unmapped century, about its skyline and its unfamiliar architecture and whether, next time, they might be allowed to stay long enough to actually explore it properly instead of simply passing through. And Koneko caught Iseei's eye across the room, something rueful and fond and thoroughly unsurprised in her expression, the particular look of two parents recognizing, all at once, that their daughter had inherited a very great deal more of her mother's fearless curiosity than either of them had quite prepared for. "She is going to be the one leading us into trouble soon enough," Koneko murmured, low enough that only Iseei could hear it, watching their daughter lean eagerly toward her grandmother's careful, considering answers, instead of the other way around. "Good," Iseei said, and meant it entirely. "I think the world could use a few more people brave enough to lean toward the unknown instead of away from it. I happen to know two of them already, and I would not trade either one for anything the world has to offer instead."